This is On Point. I'm Meghna Chakrabarti.
I think I'm a political conservative. I'm certainly a fiscal conservative. When I first started off, I was a social conservative. And in those days, social conservative almost meant a segregationist. It meant segregationist. Let's don't pussyfoot around about it.
Well, that is the voice of Denmark Groover, a longtime Georgia state representative who served off and on between 1953 to 1995. He's talking there about growing up in rural Georgia in an oral history recorded by Georgia State University in 1989.
Anybody of my generation who was raised in a rural area, or indeed anywhere in Georgia in those days, that says they were without racial prejudice was telling a lie.
Well, before the 1960s, Georgians had voted through what was known as the county unit system. We're going to hear more about how that worked a bit later. Its overall effect was to give more weight to white rural voters than black voters concentrated in Georgia's cities. Then in 1962, the Supreme Court declared the county unit system unconstitutional. Well, Denmark Groover proposed an alternative.
In 1963, when Sanders was governor, after the Baker decision, the one-man, one-vote rule, it was sort of a controversy on whether we would have people elected by majority vote. I had introduced a bill to require that they be elected by a majority vote.
Elections via majority vote. Essentially, Groover anticipated white Georgians splitting their votes among different candidates, while black Georgians might vote as a, quote, block, as he put it. In fact, a DeKalb County representative who supported Groover at the time recalled him saying, quote, "We have got to go the majority vote because all we have is a plurality, and the Negroes and the pressure groups and special interests are going to manipulate this state and take charge if we don't go for the majority vote." Well, a year later, Groover's idea eventually became law, creating Georgia's system of runoff voting.
Some of the people who were then of the most liberal persuasion were decrying my interest in majority vote because of their own personal political programs.
Well, recall, this is 1963 and 1964, the years of John F. Kennedy's assassination, the March on Washington, the passage of the Civil Rights Act. Well, by 1989, Groover said in that oral history with Georgia State University that though he did not apologize for the past, quote, "My views have changed. I have mellowed."
In his day, I decried everything that Martin Luther King Jr. stood for. Today, I recognize that he and his philosophy and his activities probably forced me and Georgia into acts and actions and beliefs that were beneficial to all of us, including me.
So there we have the beginnings of an outline to understand how Georgia ended up with its runoff voting system. Adrienne Jones joins us. She's an assistant professor of political science at Morehouse College. And Professor Jones, welcome to On Point.
Thank you. Hello.
And Professor Jones joins us from Atlanta. Also with us from Dallas, Texas, is Cal Jilson. He's a professor of political science at Southern Methodist University and is author of Pursuing the American Dream, Opportunity and Exclusion Over 4 Centuries, and The American Dream in History, Politics, and Fiction. Professor Jilson, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's talk about the county unit system beforehand a little bit more, because as I mentioned earlier, in 1962, the Supreme Court found that system of voting unconstitutional. So Professor Jones, explain to us. I mean, I had actually never really heard of it until relatively recently. What was the county unit system?
The poor man's electoral college in the state of Georgia. This allowed rural control of elections. So you've got a point system where each county gets, there are 159 counties, each county gets 2 county unit votes per representative in the state house. So the 8 highest populated counties get 6, 30 counties get 4, and 121 counties get 2, which sounds like a small number, but leaves 121 rural counties controlling 60% of the vote. So for governor, for senator, for secretary of state, AG, you never need a majority. You only need a majority for certain offices like governor and senator in the county unit vote. And you only need a plurality of the same for things like secretary of state or attorney general. And so this allows rural counties initially to have some control over the economy, minimize taxes in farm areas, and especially once the white primary is outlawed by the Supreme Court, it helps to contain the black vote, which sits in the urban areas. And so under the county unit system, some voters outside, for example, Fulton County, where I live in Atlanta, would have multiple times the amount of votes shared than a Fulton County citizen. So in some places, 11 times the amount of the worth of my vote, or 25 times in 45 other counties.
Wow.
So this allows some control over the state house and make sure that it stays white.
So, Professor Gilson, then, let me ask you this. It sounds as if the county unit system was, also layered in with the, profound voter suppression that was happening throughout the South and including in Georgia through the Jim Crow era in the 50s and 60s as well. So was the county unit system just further disenfranchising Black Georgians?
It was. The Jim Crow voter system dates from the late 19th century, the post-Reconstruction era after the Civil War, and runs all the way up into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And it had multiple elements. Maybe the most famous is the poll tax, which Georgia adopted in 1877 and wasn't outlawed until the 24th Amendment in 1964. So Georgia in the late 19th century and the first decade or so of the 20th century built an electoral system based on the poll tax, unlimited voter registration, literacy tests, grandfather clause, the white primary. And those elements of the Jim Crow electoral system stayed in place through the early decades of the 20th century and were taken apart effectively one at a time as the federal courts or the Congress outlawed various elements of the Jim Crow voter registration and electoral system. And as an element of it was struck down by the courts or the Congress, new elements were added. Mm-hmm. So that when the county unit system established in 1917 was struck down in 1963, 64, the runoff system came in its place.
Where else is runoff voting used? And do you think it's still sort of an effective means of electing lawmakers?
It's used in 9 or 10, really 8 or 9 probably southern states. And then a couple of other states have versions of runoff, including North Dakota, I think. And the effectiveness of runoffs as a racial device is different in different states, depending on the demographics of the state. I think that Professor Jones is right that it's not effective in Georgia, but it might well be in South Carolina and Alabama today. So the question of whether runoffs are outdated, I think, is a very real one. And, if it were up to me and I could do it by myself, I would get rid of them and go to plurality voting.
Okay. Well, there are some arguments in favor of runoff voting. I'm thinking of the argument where folks say that, well, it forces candidates towards the middle for the runoff itself, right? That in a plurality situation, you might end up with more extreme candidates because they don't have to convince the majority of voters.
I think it's important to talk about electoral systems as packages of laws and rules, and the question about whether there are other devices beyond the runoff.
We've got a lot of listeners saying ranked choice voting could be an answer.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, or cumulative, or something that's more malleable.
Professor Jones, thank you so much for joining us today. Professor Cal Gilson, professor of political science at Southern Methodist University and author of many books on voting in American history, including Pursuing the American Dream, Opportunity and Exclusion Over 4 Centuries. I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. This is On Point.